Welcome to episode 104 of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bowen. Happy Saturday to everyone. Just in terms of announcements, this Friday I will have Jennifer Roach on to discuss justification in LDS and evangelical theologies. So that'll be a fun one. It's going to be like an expansion upon her very fun FAIR conference from yesterday, where she touched upon the topic. So we'll be discussing imputation, forensic justification, and maybe also baptism. So that'll be fun. And on the following day, Jabber Ganim will be coming on to discuss Zion Part 2, so it's a follow-up to his previous episode on Zion in LDS tradition. And on the following Friday, I will have a convert to the church, Josh Palmer, who has written an extensive book on his conversion as a young person who encountered the CES letter and other issues and how apologetics helped his faith and come into the church as well. So fun topics. And I might have Stanford Carmack on to discuss early modern English, biblical quotations, and other fun stuff in the Book of Mormon in the near future. And my friend Walker Wright, whose book has been published by FAIR, Nourishing the Roots, hopefully will be coming on to discuss his book in September as well. So some fun things to look out for. So with that as background, I'm sure some have heard the tragic news. Now, I'm not going to name names because they have not gone public or their family has not gone public. But if you know, you know. So definitely keep their family, especially their wife, in your prayers. It's always tragic when someone passes away. But on that rather somber note, I'm joined by a very good friend of mine, Jacob Vidrine, in Utah. Jacob, you've been a guest on this, but it's been a bit of a hot minute. So how are you keeping?
I'm doing good. Just staying busy, busy with family, with work, with life, but still trying to stay up to date on, what's new in, history, church history matters and, what's going on in apologetics and stuff. And so it's always exciting to stay up to date on these subjects just because there's, always new things. And so, I hope that what we discuss today will be some new things to that's helpful to the audience.
Yeah.
So
Well, before we begin, by the way, like Jacob has been on in the past. We've discussed like his work on a topic that I've done some work on as well, like the idea, like the reintroduction of animal sacrifices and the nature of atonement, which was fun. In fact, I think that's how we actually got connected. He once dropped me a PM and said, like, I'm interested in this topic as well. So that was fun.
yeah, we had this niche interest, and Joseph Smith said that this would be restored, and there seems to be a biblical precedent for this being restored. And so we both had a similar research interest on that subject, and so it ended up being a fun little niche podcast to do. And I
Yeah,
think
and
that was the very first podcast I've actually done where I've been on a podcast with someone. So
cool.
if I remember right, so.
Cool. And also, you've been on before. I think the last episode was like a very lengthy and excellent episode on, like, say, fundamentalist history and various groups as well, and all that fun stuff. You do put the fun back into fundamentalism. But before we're going to get into like an introduction, I know you've done some recent work on the authenticity of the William Clayton journals. So do you want to give, like, say, a brief overview, like, say, what that is and why it's important before we're going to get into the topic proper? Because, it's a current issue even today.
Yeah, I'm obviously an amateur on that subject, but sometimes the amateurs are the ones who put in kind of the groundwork to kind of know the arguments and be able to know the issues of a subject where people who are the more robust scholars, don't quite know what say the conspiracy theories on the internet are. And so, one of my hobbies has been kind of responding to the polygamy denial movement online. And so we've had a couple podcasts where we've talked about that. And, and for better or for worse, it's continues to grow on the internet. And I think as it's been growing, there's been more and more people who've realized that you need to respond to this stuff. And I think one of the things that was announced at FAIR in the conference the last couple of days was that the FAIR is going to be doing a series kind of on that subject. Is that kind of correct? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes. Shout out to Burton, who's done excellent work, such as The Angel, but he put together, like, say, a sizzle reel, I think that's what they call in the industry, where like various people, including the late Sarah Allen, discussing like plural marriage. So it's gonna be with Jennifer Roach and others as well. So yeah, and with the amount of funding they actually managed to get, fortunately, I think it will happen. So it's going to be very well documented, because it's not just going to be history, it's going to be like women issues and a host of other things as well. Because I know you know this, a lot of the depictions is like, well, 19th century women who engage in polygamy were, like, say, chattel slavery when they actually saw it as
It's
empowering.
worse than slavery. I've heard some of these people
Yeah,
say that, yeah, that the polygamy is worse than slavery, according to certain. Um, I guess there's a meme once where it said that Hagar wasn't actually the wife of Abraham. I'm not okay with him having her as a wife, but I am okay with interpreting her as being a sex slave according to the culture of the time. That's kind of the mentality they have about, how terrible polygamy is. And it's good to see that there's going to be some good, apologetics responding to that. And, I'm just kind of saying, going back to kind of the William Clayton diaries, these are one of the primary, there's very few contemporaneous friendly sources in Nauvoo, obviously because it was a secret practice. And William Clayton was an insider. He was a clerk to Joseph Smith, and he probably kept one of the most thorough records of contemporaneous details regarding plural marriage in his own personal practice, as well as Joseph teaching him about it. And obviously, he also was the scribe for D&C 132. And so, me and Mark Tensmeyer, I think you've actually had him on your program before, if I'm remembering right.
yeah. I
Mark
had him
has
on like
done,
a year and a half ago to discuss his work on Joseph Smith being a polygamist, which I know for a lot of people it's like duh, but unfortunately there's been a revival, as you know, of the idea like Brigham introduced it and had Joseph whacked and other nonsense.
yeah, it's just kind of like the internet, for better or for worse, has allowed all sorts of conspiracies to that really don't hold water. I'm not against a good conspiracy theory, entertaining one, but the problem is this is not a good conspiracy theory when you actually look at the totality of the evidence. And so, what Mark Tensmeyer's done is he's like tried to very thoroughly understand all of the arguments by the polygamy deniers, and then be able and then like actually look at them in a systematic way, and to respond to them in a very balanced way. And so Mark has done great work. He did a chapter in the book Secret Covenants on the subject. And just for that chapter alone, I think that would be, getting that book is worth it just for Mark's chapter alone. I understand that, he's, Mark's that was like boiling down his research. Like he's done, like he could honestly write a whole book on the subject himself on, dealing with that issue. But yeah, he and I have kind of tag teamed this issue and kind of brainstormed different aspects of the arguments that are advanced out there. And so, with the William Clayton diaries, the church announced, the LDS church announced that they're being published in, they announced it back in 2016, and they're finally, back then they kind of said, after the Joseph Smith papers projects are done, then we will get to the Clayton diaries. And so some people think that there's some nefarious conspiracy there about them not getting around to it for a decade, but in reality, that was what was stated to people at the time, that they wanted to wrap everything else up. And then that's kind of like a bonus, like doing the Council of 50 Minutes, the Nauvoo Council of 50 Minutes, published in 2016, was a bonus that the Joseph Smith papers did. And the Clayton Diaries is another bonus, and we're all really excited for them. But what happened was that James B. Allen and Dean Jesse's transcript of the Clayton Diaries got leaked online. Um, and their TypeScript was made in the 1970s, but it was shared online a couple months ago, I think in June. And so that kind of, we already had most of the exciting stuff. I know that the Joseph Smith papers editors have made comments along those lines that most of the exciting stuff in the Clayton diaries got leaked in the 70s and 80s. Like Ehat was using it in his thesis. The Tanners got a copy unauthorized of Ehat's notes and published it. And George D. Smith eventually published those notes along with other extracts from Clayton's diaries that he was able to get a hold of in an intimate chronicle in the 1990s. But that's not the full diaries. And James B. Allen at the time kind of commented that this is, that publication is like less than half of the entries in William Clayton's diary. And so what happened, in June, was that the full TypeScript from the 70s was shared. And so it's been fun to kind of dig through them and they don't really, all the, like I said, all the very fascinating stuff about polygamy was already, we already had like the vast majority of those entries. But there was other interesting things to dig into with the Clayton diaries. There was new significant materials as it pertained to, Clayton's daily activities in Nauvoo, as it pertained to, Clayton's own personal practice of plural marriage, like different there's a lot more entries relating to his own personal practice of polygamy in Nauvoo. There were entries kind of relating to um, his daily work. There was a lot of entries post martyrdom after Joseph Smith's death about, say, mob violence, mob activity, and conflicts with the saints, and stuff relating to the Nauvoo Temple construction. And then finally, when the temple is completed in 1845, the ordinances that were going on, it's just kind of, he kept good records in his own personal diary of the list of people that were involved in the first week or two of the Nauvoo Temple, and also kind of gave just general details about himself helping out in various duties in regards to it, and also his wives, I believe, participated in helping assist in the Nauvoo Temple process. And so, yeah, there was a bunch of fascinating things, and so this kind of brought, the typescripts being shared online, which I do think was in many ways disrespectful to the Joseph Smith Papers Project, because these guys have been working on this for several years, and to have their work kind of like swept, their thunder kind of swept out from under them by an unauthorized, leak of it. I do think that wasn't fair, but it's out there, and once the source is kind of out there, historians generally uh, believe that it's fair game to to at least weigh what the source is, even if you're got mixed emotions about the way that it was released. And so I'm still looking forward to the JSP volume. So I did a couple videos that were in-depth, deep dives into the Clayton diaries in response. Like I spent 2 months just kind of pouring through the entries, and multiple times kind of like I've got to reread and look for this certain subject or this certain subject or this subject, and just kind of compiling notes. And so I gave two kind of lengthy presentations on the William Clayton's Nauvoo diaries. The first one kind of went into all the plural marriage related stuff, and also kind of reasons why I believe, evidences that it was a legit record in Nauvoo, contrary to conspiracy theories that, oh, it was made up years later to promote Brigham Young. And then the second part two presentation I did kind of deep dived into other significant aspects, where he talks about temple work under Joseph Smith's lifetime, because Clayton had received temple ordinances in the Anointed Quorum in Joseph Smith's lifetime before the martyrdom. Also, the Council of 50 in Joseph Smith's lifetime, and just kind of succession related entries, entries relating to the martyrdom. I think that Clayton wrote some fascinating entries, kind of contextualizing the martyrdom as Joseph was willing to, that part of the reason that we don't really talk about for the martyrdom is that Joseph was willing to give up his life to save the city of Nauvoo, to save the saints from potential mob action against them. And so I liked, to see Clayton's description of the martyrdom in that way, and his kind of lamentation and his love of Joseph Smith and the Restoration, like that kind of comes out all throughout his diaries, that he was deeply devoted to Joseph Smith. I think I saw one polygamy denier make a comment saying, "Oh, this is so odd for his 1843 diary to be talking more about Joseph Smith than about his own life." And it's like, if you're like the scribe for the guy that's the prophet of God to the restored the gospel to the world, I think you'd be pretty interested in, his own personal life. And so, I think the JSP editors have commented that Clayton at times is keeping a more detailed record of what Joseph Smith's day-to-day activities are than even Joseph Smith's own personal journal that was being kept for him by Willard Richards. And so he's just an invaluable source for a number of reasons. And if you're interested in Mormon history, especially the Nauvoo period and the temple and everything else that's going on in Nauvoo, Clayton is an invaluable source. Also, just for Joseph's teachings, like he was recording sermons and brief summaries of sermons in his diary as well. And so we have a lot to thank William Clayton for in his record keeping. And so important subjects to understand, especially because you have different people online who will try to say that, oh, these diaries are fabricated, they aren't legitimate. I think I came up with a list of like 10 reasons that I put together in a couple short videos on, five in one video, five in the other, why I think Clayton's record is contemporaneous and reliable. And so, yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and I hope I haven't listened to it yet, but I understand that the at least one presentation at the fair conference went into the Clayton diaries and by one of those like I said, one of the experts who's a lot more qualified to talk about them than I am. And so I'm excited for their volume, even just because they have spent so much time pouring through Joseph Smith related, Nauvoo era related stuff, that their footnotes that they're going to have
Yeah.
and commentary that they have on the diaries, I think is going to be incredibly invaluable to contextualize and to understand them. So I'm still looking forward to next year when Yale publishes the Clayton Diaries in partnership with the Joseph Smith Papers Project. So
No, I agree. Even just for the footnotes, because I read the journals of Joseph Smith before, like the Scott Follering and American Prophet Record one, which was good for the 80s. Don't get me wrong, but like the notes in all the JSP volumes, even for topics I knew a lot about, are like really informative. So I'm sure,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. When you read the Joseph Smith papers, like those, the footnotes are just as invaluable as the transcriptions themselves. Those guys are pros, and you can't praise them enough for how meticulous they have been in looking at all sorts of subjects to better contextualize Joseph Smith and other aspects of the Restoration and church history in Nauvoo. So.
Cool. Well, with that bit of a tangent, today we will be discussing the Transfiguration of Brigham Young. So, Jacob, why did you choose this particular topic? Is there some kind of relationship to what day it is today? And why is it so important? And what got you interested in this? And then once you can answer that, I'll let you give your presentation and we take it from there.
Yeah, so today is August 8th, which is the anniversary of the initial succession meeting in Nauvoo after the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram, where there was the succession crisis. And if you understand church history, there were different contenders wanting to be the successor to the church. And we, as Brighamites, I'm a fundamentalist, but I still, um, share tons of theological commonality with mainstream Latter-day Saints on the subject of understanding succession and honoring and revering Brigham Young as Joseph Smith's legitimate successor, especially in contrast to what the alternatives were of Rigdon or James Strang or Joseph III eventually kind of leads his own competing organization. And so the succession crisis has always been a fascinating thing to me because, I believe that, well, first of all, I think that Brigham Young was the legitimate successor, but it's like the different arguments that different contenders made basically emphasized different aspects of Joseph Smith's theology and things that had occurred prior to Joseph's death. And so everyone got little pieces of the restoration in that regard. But I do think that Brigham Young had the most of them. Is the best way or simplest way to put it is that Brigham Young, I think, did more than anyone else to preserve Joseph Smith's the institutional organization that Joseph Smith had established, as well as the theology of Joseph Smith. And I'm not saying that Brigham Young's theology matched up 100% with Joseph's and absolutely everything. I think that anyone who's studied Brigham Young would know that. Well, I mean, Joseph Smith's theology developed over time, and Brigham Young's did as well. And so, at different times, they have different ideas. But I do think that Brigham, by and large, really genuinely cared about Joseph Smith's preserving Joseph Smith's teachings. one of the statements in the Council of 50 Minutes after Joseph Smith's death was that Brigham Young, if I'm remembering the statement correctly, said that to preserve the teachings of and measures of Joseph Smith to him was sweeter than honey or the honeycomb. Like he felt that it was the most imperative thing for them to do to try to preserve what Joseph Smith had restored. And so that succession meeting is a pivotal moment where the church in Nauvoo as a body sustained the 12 to act as the first presidency as a united quorum based off of section 107, saying that the 12 as a body, as a united voice, were equal to the first presidency. And so they extrapolated that they could act as the first presidency in the absence of the president of the church being killed. And so that's an important event and turning point in church history, that meeting. And also I would say another very important aspect is that there seems to be a miraculous event. I say seems to be as a scholar, hedging your words. I believe the transfiguration of Brigham Young actually happened. I think that there's been various academic arguments to diminish it. Van Wagner is the one who's the most notorious for popularizing, trying to discredit the transfiguration of Brigham Young as just kind of a folklore or myth that developed over time. And, his arguments have been circulated widely by people who are opponents to Brigham Young. And a lot of scholars have accepted his arguments. And in some cases, I understand why that's the case, because it's kind of hard to, as a historian, to, to accept the validity of miracles. That there's, controversy where your academic historian who's not a believer isn't going to want to interpret it in a believing manner. But I still think you got to contextualize that this was experience that many people, hundreds. I think there's Lynne Jorgensen has done probably the most extensive work on the transfiguration of Brigham Young, and they compiled, I think, over 126 unique accounts of different people of the transfiguration of Brigham Young. And so transfiguration is a very important subject because it shows that for a believer who believes that Brigham Young was a legitimate successor of Joseph Smith, it shows that this was honored by God and that God and Joseph Smith had honor to Brigham Young as the stepping forward to be the successor. And then after that, you see Brigham Young take full leadership of the church from that point forward. So that's, I think, a very significant event. And we'll cover both Van Wagner's arguments against the Transfiguration and then kind of some of my responses to it when we talk about the Transfiguration in more depth later on in this discussion. So,
That's cool.
so
So
yeah, I guess.
I know you have a presentation. So while these, like, I'll let you present. And if there's any questions from myself or the audience, I'll let you know when you finish a slide. But you can continue until then, and we can take it from there.
Yeah, feel free to interrupt me at any of my slides. I just prepared a couple of short slides to kind of, on the subject of honoring Brigham Young, and reasons for his for why I accept his succession, and better arguments to understand the succession to Brigham Young. So, honoring Brigham Young. Is my slide showing? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to just start off with 3 quotes kind of about honoring Brigham Young. I've been kind of pouring through Journal of Discourses, Volume 19. I saw some recent discussion back and forth about whether Latter-day Saints should study the Journal of Discourses. And I agree with the post that was made by Christopher Blythe saying that, you should, that he thinks that everyone should be familiar with the history and with the statements by early leaders, to better understand not, the history of the church, as well as to have a richer appreciation for the teachings and the theologies and views of the early brethren, even if you don't agree with everything. Like I don't agree with everything that's in the Journal of Discourses, but I find a lot of inspired counsel and inspired teachings in there, and so that's kind of my short pitch for the journal for being better acquainted with the Journal of Discourses. So just first two quotes, because in my Journal of Discourses study, it's right at the end of Brigham's life in 1877, and uh, right after his death. And so there were some good quotes that stood out to me honoring him. So this first one is by Orson Pratt, and Orson Pratt and Brigham butted heads, but so that's kind of I appreciate that he was willing to speak very, very positively about Brigham. I mean, I think throughout the Journal of Discourses, and when you actually study the depth of Orson Pratt and Brigham Young butting heads, I actually recently did a presentation on this called the Great Adam God Debate, and also kind of did some deep dives into the other theological disagreements between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt. I think they genuinely cared about each other, and they loved each other even in their very heated disagreements on theology. And so I actually admire that history, for showing that you can have extreme disagreement with someone and still have brotherly love for them. And so just Orson Pratt at the conference after Brigham Young's death on October 5th, 1877, made this comment. We feel with all our hearts to mourn with the Latter-day Saints in the loss of so great and good a man as the President, who has led us with marked success for 1/3 of a century. He was the instrument in the hands of God of bringing the people forth some 1,400 miles from the great Mississippi River over wild, barren, and trackless plains, and locating us here in the great American desert. He has been the instrument in the hands of God of giving counsel and instruction for the numerous towns, cities, and villages through our mountain region. He has been foremost in the encouragement of home manufacturers and home industries, introducing at his own expense much machinery into the territory so as to make the Latter day Saints, as far as possible, a self sustaining people. He has labored diligently during the last years of his life to bring about a greater degree of union among the Latter day Saints in regard to temporal things. And near the close of his useful life, he was wrought upon by the Spirit of God, and more especially on his last mission at St. George, to give counsel to the 12 apostles to go into all parts of the territory and more fully organize the people according to the revelations and commandments and institutions of heaven as given by revelation through the prophet Joseph Smith. Having accomplished so great a work in leading forth the people of God and locating them here in these mountains, so far as what is for so far from what is termed civilization, having redeemed the desert, established academics and academies and schoolhouses, tabernacles and temples, home manufacturers and home industries, and finally having organized the saints into stakes, appointing bishops, and having them ordained in all parts of our territory, having fulfilled and completed the work, the Lord has taken him to himself. So I just like that summary that, he brought the saints to Utah and he led them in to be economically independent in an area where they were far from civilization, established, dozens and dozens of towns throughout his life, and taught the saints, practically how to be more economically independent and economically united. And then also he talks about the spiritual direction he gave in the institutional organization of the church. One aspect of Brigham's life that is kind of generally overlooked is that in 1877, he wanted to get the church more organized according to the revelations of Joseph Smith and the Doctrine and Covenants. And so that's something that came up quite a bit in 1877 in discourses that I've read. And so he mentioned that, and then obviously building tabernacles and temples and perpetuating missionary work and temple ordinances and the church structure as Joseph Smith had established it. So the next slide is a quote by Daniel H. Wells, because some people will criticize Brigham Young because he got very wealthy. That seemed to be a very regular critique if you've ever heard anyone criticize Brigham Young. But one of the things that is not as emphasized by those people is that he uh, that he was able to make lots of poor individuals who came to Deseret, came to the Rocky Mountains to be gathered in Utah. He was able to help them to become economically independent themselves and help them to flourish economically. And so this statement by Daniel H. Wells recognized that. And this was only a week or two before Brigham's death on August 18th, 1877. He said, "A stripling came forth with the message from heaven, leading out, guiding, and directing the affairs of the kingdom as they were made manifest to him by the Lord from time to time, until it has grown to become a great people. It has gone forth and continued to grow until we find it is as this day here in these valleys of the mountains, with a people dwelling in a hundred towns, cities, and settlements. Poor people? Yes, the majority of cases, I might say in all cases, poor people, laboring people who have come here, a good many of them, without anything excepting their hands to obtain a substance, all poor alike, very little difference to find an inheritance. I do not suppose that a parallel can be found since the God of heaven gave Israel their inheritance in the land of Palestine. We see many people who have received inheritances. Poor people who had nothing of this world's goods have received inheritances and been blessed in a temporal point of view. I presume and believe that President Brigham Young has done more to obtain inheritances for the people, the poor among men, in the last 30 years than all the emigrating and philanthropic societies in the world, putting them all together existing at the present time. I do not think it has been equaled since the days of Israel, when Palestine was divided out and given to the sons of Jacob. If it has, I have no knowledge of it, and I read a good deal." So one thing that is mentioned, I've seen repeatedly, in the Journal of Discourses, is that people were put in a situation in Utah where you were poor when you immigrated, but the goal was to get them to be able to have, a degree of economic independence, where everyone would have their own lot, their own garden, their own team, back in those days. And that was one of the great things that they praised Brigham for, was the perpetual immigration program and being able to get the saints to be united in helping people to get out of poverty and to be able to be in a much better situation than they were before. And so that's not emphasized. And one quote in the Journal of Discourses that I liked from Heber C. Kimball said that, when people will criticize the apostles because they built big houses for their big families, if they were living plural marriage, they had lots of children and multiple wives, and so they needed to have bigger houses, and so their houses were generally considered mansions. And what they talked about, what I heard Heber C. Kimball in one sermon in the Journal of Discourses said, was that we want everyone to be able to build themselves, a nice, big house, and situated with all the luxuries that they're able to get. And so it was about lifting people up. It wasn't this kind of, some people have a mentality that it was them, that Brigham was getting rich while the people were, not, when repeatedly they talked about that not being the case. So, and obviously Brigham warned about the love of riches, and he says, he said that was probably one of the biggest dangers that the Latter-day Saints could have, is the having their heart set on riches. But if you have riches and you want to use them to serve God, that is the proper time that it's good to have the wealth and temporal blessings of this world. So last quote on honoring Brigham that I wanted to use is a statement by Wilford Woodruff, kind of honoring Brigham's spiritual leadership of the saints, and especially in regards to building temples and perpetuating the temple ordinances that Joseph Smith had restored. He said, quote, and so this is in a conference address on April 25th, 1891. He said, "The spirit of inspiration was with Brigham Young from the day that he entered into this work until he laid down his life upon his bed. I bear testimony to these things. There never has been a time, either in these temples or anywhere else, but the Lord has made manifest his will on any point on which light was desired. To my certain knowledge, the Lord gave revelations in the St. George Temple to his servants there upon points of doctrine we did not understand. President Young was there. I was there. Brother McAllister and others labored there, and we knew these things. When the scroll shall be unfolded, listing the life's labors of Brigham Young, he will be recognized as one of the world's greatest benefactors. As a leader, the world will search in vain for one who surpasses him in righteous achievement and valor in history's great trek across an uncharted desert. He was indeed a prophet who prophesied, a seer who saw, and a revelator who revealed. He was, like all great men, one whom the righteous loved and whom the wicked hated. He labored on the Kirtland Temple as a superintendent in the glazing, painting, and finishing of it. He dedicated the Far West Temple site on July 4th, that should be 1838, not 1938. He dedicated the completed portion of the Nauvoo Temple on October 5th, 1845. I think that should be December 5th, 1845, and laid its capstone. He offered the dedicatory prayer on April 1st, 1874, when the cornerstones of the St. George Temple were laid. He took up an active and overseeing part in the choosing of the sites or drawing up of architectural plans or encouraging construction of temples at St. George, Logan, Manti, and Salt Lake, in addition to his great physical labors on the Kirtland and Nauvoo temples. His contributions in this volume attest his greatness. He was truly a worthy successor and a devoted friend to the prophet Joseph, to the Latter-day Saints, and to God. Okay, so to get on to the succession meeting on August 8th, 1844. So I really like Brigham Young's own personal diary entry for this day. I don't know if it was actually ever published um, in his lifetime. It's more of a very personal entry. I don't think it was. I don't think it was used until historians started pouring through his personal diaries, in the 20th century. So this is what Brigham wrote for that day. He said, August the 8th, 1844, and it's kind of that very rudimentary spelling of, the pioneer English. And so I endear that their, poor spelling, but it can be difficult at times for, some people, really aren't a fan of it. But I'll just read the entry. So August the 8th, 1844, this day is long to be remembered by me. It is the first time I have met with the church at Nauvoo since brothers Joseph and Hiram was killed, and the occasion on which the church was called together somewhat painful to me. Brother Sidney Rigdon had come from Pittsburgh to see the brethren and find out if they would sustain him as the leader of the saints. I perceived a spirit to hurry business, to get up a trustee and trust and a presidency over the church, priesthood or no priesthood, right or wrong, and this grieved my heart. Now that Joseph is gone, it seemed as though many want to draw off a party and be leaders. But this cannot be. The church must be one, or they are not the Lord's. The saints looked as though they had lost a friend that was able and willing to counsel them in all things. In this time of sorrow, my heart was filled with compassion. And after Brother Rigdon had made a long speech to the saints, I should think 5,000, I arose and spoke to the people. My heart was swollen with compassion towards them, and by the power of the Holy Ghost, even the spirit of the prophets, I was enabled to comfort the hearts of the saints. And so he's just mentioning there that at the end of this morning meeting on August 8th, 1844, he made a brief couple remarks to the saints at that time, but he felt that through the Spirit, he was able to comfort them, in contrast to what Rigdon was proposing. So then he continues his entry. In the afternoon, according to my request, the people assembled by thousands. I laid before them the order of the church and the power of the priesthood. After a long and laborious talk of about 2 hours in the open air, with the wind blowing, the church was of one heart and one mind. They wanted the 12 to lead the church as Brother Joseph had done in his day. Brother Rigdon was called upon to make some remarks, but refused to do so. I called upon the church to express their wishes by vote if they wanted Brother Rigdon for their president, on which motion Brother Rigdon objected and wanted the vote called to see if the church wanted the 12 to preside, and it was done. And the church, with one heart and voice, lifted up their hands and for the 12 to preside. In this meeting, the quorums was organized, the high council, high priest, 70s elders, etc., etc. So, I liked his the way he wrote it, that it was about comforting the saints, and he was opposed to the spirit of individuals wanting to draw up a party and be leaders, which Rigdon was one of those people, but there were others who had that spirit. And he said the church must be one or they are not the Lord's. So yeah, I don't know, Robert, do you have any thoughts on this diary entry or questions before I move on to the
Um,
next?
no, just like a Ethan Sunday says, "Hi Jacob, hope you're doing well. Our families were neighbors growing up, so former neighbor of yours is in the chat."
Oh, hey, Ethan. I do remember the Sundays.
Cool. No, so far so good. So I'll let you continue.
Yeah. Okay. So, continuing, in December of 1847, when they're having their discussions about reorganizing the first presidency, this is fast forward 3 years, there was kind of a reminiscence about, Brigham's remarks at the August 8th conference. And basically, it was an accident. What's funny about this is it was actually kind of an accident that he was able to stumble upon Rigdon's meeting trying to propose a presidency, trying to propose himself as being a guardian of the church. That what had happened was that the 12 got back to Nauvoo and they said, there was a meeting scheduled for that Thursday, August 8th. And they said, actually, let's postpone it till Sunday. And so the apostles kind of thought that everyone had agreed to postpone it, but then Rigdon kind of went and round and postponed it and basically was like, hey, we're having the meeting anyway. And Brigham just kind of stumbled into the meeting at the end of it and then was able to kind of offer a counter perspective to Sidney Rigdon there. So this is Brigham recalling that. He said, when Sidney Rigdon, and so what the rest of the 12 were actually meeting, they had a morning meeting that morning where they were in a council meeting. And so Brigham stumbled upon the meeting first, and then the rest of the 12 kind of, poured in kind of afterwards. And so this is kind of recalling that. So he said, when Sidney Rigdon came back, I walked up to the meeting alone. I asked Lyman White if he would go, but he said no. A man that would follow Sidney Rigdon, I don't care a damn. I did not ask the people if I might speak. I just spoke as I did. Then Willard Richards comments, a council was appointed at my office at 9 o'clock that day, and instead of your coming to the council, you went to a meeting. You expected to meet us in council. And Brigham Young kind of commented, I think that there's some jest in here, but he says, I don't own to that. And if such an item goes into history, I'd tear it out if written in a book of gold. So Lloyd Richardson said, it was simply this. We expected to meet together and we thought something had happened and went to the stand and found you there. Then uh, Brigham Young says, do you know of me making an appointment and not being there? Then George A. Smith comments, you're sometimes in council to an hour or two, and laughs. Then Brigham Young says, Sidney Rigdon and Thomas Marks, that should be actually Marks. It should be William Marks, not Thomas Marks. The minutes are incorrect there. Rigdon and Marks told us the meeting was not going to be, and I saw the brethren gathering and went. Then Will Richards says, there's nothing in the history to show you are defective. Brigham Young, now that by talking about it, I begin to recollect it. And then Heber C. Kimball says, I know you were at the stand, but a very few minutes. And so that's kind of the movie 6 Days in August actually does kind of capture that kind of Brigham accidentally stumbling into the meeting kind of aspect of the succession meeting on that day. And so what's the miracle that we're talking, that's the big deal about the August 8th meeting was that many people saw a transfiguration of Brigham Young to look and sound like the prophet Joseph Smith. And there's a lot of accounts of this. I'm not going to go into a long, lengthy presentation on this. I promised Robert I wasn't going to do that. And so just one quote that kind of summarizes by Benjamin F. Johnson. He said, a conference was assembled and President Rigdon was called upon to put forth his claim before the people, which he did. And after closing his remarks, which were void of all power or influence, President Brigham Young arose and spoke. I saw him arise, but as soon as he spoke, I jumped to my feet, for in every possible degree it was Joseph's voice, and his person in look, attitude, dress, and appearance was Joseph himself, personified, and I knew in a moment that the spirit and mantle of Joseph was upon him. And so there's been back and forth on the subject of the transfiguration of Brigham Young. As I mentioned, Van Wagner popularized arguments against it being a legitimate miracle, where Lynne Jorgensen, first in an article, but then it was later expanded to be a massive chapter of a book, kind of countered that by collecting lots of accounts of the transfiguration of Brigham Young and kind of contextualizing them. And so, just to kind of talk about some of the, just briefly, the arguments against the transfiguration. So, I kind of cover this in a paper I did called Succession to Brigham Young. I have a little pamphlet here of it. Let me unblur my background for a minute. I guess you can't see it because of the brightness of um, it, but I made it in honor of the Transfiguration of Brigham Young and the Succession meeting of August 8th. It's a free download. I'll give Robert the link to post. Anyone who ever wants a PDF of one of my papers, just send me a message. I'm happy
Yeah,
to share.
yeah.
But
Just on that. After the episode, just send the link, and I'll put in the show notes. And if there's any other articles you want me to link to in the show notes and any other sites, just let me know and I'll include them.
okay, sounds good. Yeah, so there's a number of arguments against the transfiguration of Brigham Young, and I'm going to just briefly respond to them. So the first one is that the claim is that there's no early witnesses, that this transfiguration isn't talked about until years later in Utah, decades later. But D. Michael Quinn actually did an excellent job responding to this, and in his paper on the Mormon succession crisis of 1844, published in BYU Studies in 1976, where he pulled up a number of early accounts of the Transfiguration. And so that's actually, if I'm remembering right, he writes that even before Van Wagner's paper, which wasn't published until the 1990s. And Van Wagner doesn't really even address Quinn's argument. He's just making a counterclaim. And so there's a number of early sources that Quinn puts together. One of them is by Henry and Catherine Brooke on November 15th, 1844, where they say that the loss of brothers, this is in a letter they wrote, the loss of brothers Joseph and Hiram has been greatly felt, but we have the 12 apostles to preside in their stead. Brother Brigham Young is president of the 12 and stands as prophet, seer, and revelator to the church. He is an excellent man and favors Brother Joseph both in person and manner of speaking more than any person ever you saw or looks like another. So he said that Brigham looks like Joseph and speaks like Joseph more than any other person that you've ever seen. So that's a clear reference to kind of transfiguration language. Another one that's this one is in Lynne Jorgensen. She in her paper had this said on December 8th, 1844, Jesse C. Little wrote a letter to Brigham Young mentioning a previous letter he had received from Howard Egan that made very explicit transfiguration reference. He wrote, quote, I received a letter from Brother Egan at the time of the conference. He said if a man had been blinded, he would have hardly had known if it were not Joseph. So kind of saying that if he was blind, he would have had a hard time realizing that it wasn't Joseph speaking. And so that's referencing an even earlier letter that's not extant about the transfiguration of Brigham Young. So there's a number of other great early sources. One of them that I really like is one that Fred Collier found and that he used in his paper, The Transfiguration of Brigham Young, Mormon Myth or Sacred History. I think this might be a rare source that isn't in Lynne Jorgensen's compilation. It's just a very brief allusion to it in a letter Brigham wrote to his diary 3 days after the conference. He said, quote, all things are now reviving up. The brethren prayed with all faith for us to return. I can't say much about the families of Brother Joseph and Hiram Smith, for I have not had time to call on them yet. I've been in council almost all the time since I arrived here. This much I can say, the spirit of Joseph is here, though we cannot enjoy his person. Through great anxiety of the church, there was a conference held last Thursday. The power of the priest was explained and the order thereof, on which the whole church lifted up their voices and their hands for the 12 to move forward and organize the church and lead it as Joseph led it, which is our indispensable duty to do. So, that's a very veiled allusion, but he's saying, this much I can say, the spirit of Joseph is here, though we cannot enjoy his person. So, kind of, at least from Brigham, writing to his daughter, that he felt that there was some sort of, um, spirit of Joseph with him and what was going on. So, which totally fits the idea of the transfiguration. What many accounts, um, there's many accounts of the time saying that they saw the mantle of Joseph fall on Brigham, and that the spirit and power of Elijah was explained to the saints, showing that the 12 were the ones to lead the saints. So there's a lot of others. I just want to use those three um, references to that kind of contradict the idea that there was not any early sources about it. All three of those sources are from 1844. So the second one that Van Wagner uses is the claim that there were no contemporary journal entries about it. So therefore, we can't trust these reminiscences. And so Lynne Jorgensen responds to that by pointing out that there's actually very, very few people that are keeping contemporaneous diaries in that time period. So Lynne Jorgensen wrote in Mantle of the Prophet, quote, some diarists who've been keeping fairly regular diaries stopped writing around the time of the martyrdom and did not resume until later. For example, Thomas Bullock's personal diary shows a gap from June 15th until October 8th, 1844. Charles C. Rich made no entries from June 28th, 1844 to January 1st, 1845. Eliza R. Snow ceased writing in April of 1843 and did not resume until February of 1846. And so Van Wagner makes a very big deal about Wilford Woodruff's diary on that day, because he said that Woodruff wrote over 2,200 word diary entry for the August 8th day. And so to him, it's absurd to think that if the Transfiguration happened, that that Woodruff would leave it out. And so my kind of rebuttal to that in the past has been in my paper was uh, that saying 2,200 words were written isn't as impressive when you realize that the vast majority, like over 2,000 of those words were Woodruff copying the minutes of that conference into his diary. And so he's just copying the minutes of what was said in that conference meeting into his diary. He's not writing a very lengthy argument about his own personal experience and personal feelings. But what I've came to realize with like Willard Richards, William Clayton, and Wilford Woodruff, a better argument, in my opinion, that I recently realized, probably in this year, was that they were not present for the morning meeting where Lynne Jorgensen and Fred Collier note that most of the people who recall a transfiguration experience tie it to that morning meeting, turning around and seeing Brigham very briefly look like Joseph Smith. And so they were in their council meeting of the 12 that morning. And so that would make sense why Wilford Woodruff, William Clayton, and Willard Richards wouldn't be including it if they weren't present for that morning meeting. And so that's kind of the new argument for that I would kind of articulate. But then that leads us to the next issue that Van Wagner makes, is that were there false witnesses claiming to have witnessed the Transfiguration who could not have possibly witnessed the Transfiguration? And that's kind of the key to Van Wagner's argument, is that he believed that he had a solid argument against it because both Orson Hyde and John D. Lee said that they witnessed the Transfiguration of Brigham Young, but they were not present for the August 8th conference. They did not return to Nauvoo until several days or several weeks later. I don't remember the exact details off of the top of my head. But what Lynne Jorgensen and Fred Collier in their writings defending the Transfiguration argue is that there are statements showing that people experience the Transfiguration at later occasions. Um, Lynne Jorgensen noted there's a number of accounts that tie it to the October 1844 conference. So people who didn't experience it at the August 1844 conference may have experienced it at a later time and would have been genuine in their testimony. And what Fred Collier points out is that those accounts that D. Michael Quinn argued about the Transfiguration uh, wrote about it as though it was an ongoing experience. So, that's like that Henry and Catherine Brooke letter in November of 1844 said Brigham favors Brother Joseph both in person and manner of speaking more than any person you ever saw or ever looks like another, apparently viewing it as an ongoing event rather than simply a one-time occasion. And similarly, William Burton, who wasn't there for the August 1844 conference, wrote in his diary in early 1845 that the spirit of Joseph appeared to rest upon Brigham, which also implies an ongoing experience. And so, in keeping with that, um, Catherine Crosby, in one of her accounts of the Transfiguration, wrote later, as in the 1850s, as a reminiscence, said that about the August conference, says it was the first time that I ever thought he, Brigham, resembled Joseph. And so that reference to the first time I ever thought Brigham looked like Joseph implies that it happened on more than one occasion. And so with Orson Hyde, what I kind of argue is that Orson Hyde's account of it, where he ties his vision to the 18, his experience to a conference in Nauvoo, he seems to describe it as possibly being the October 1844 conference where he experienced it. And he said that one of his wives experienced it, but the other one didn't in his account. And so that fits with, John D. Lee, is considered a false witness because he didn't return to Nauvoo at the time. But John D. Lee was writing his account of the Transfiguration in his anti-Brigham Life and Confession, the Mormonism Unveiled, the Life and Confessions of John D. Lee in 1877. And he's very pissed off at Brigham Young, but even he admits that I, at the time, imagined that there was a strong resemblance between Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. So if John D. Lee, as an anti Brigham Young person by the end of his life, right before he's being executed for his participation in the Mountain Meadows massacre, if he's admitting that he experienced it, that's a strong antagonistic witness admitting that it occurred. And so, some of the sources for it being the October 1844 conference, one of them is Brigham Young said on July 19th, 1857, where he referred to Albert Carrington giving a Transfiguration account. He said, quote, Brother Carrington's testimony proves to you that men's eyes are liable to be deceived. It may appear strange to some that he could not tell me from Joseph Smith when I was speaking in the stand in Nauvoo during the October conference of 1844. Someone came along and passed a finger over his eyes, and he could not see anyone but Joseph speaking until I got through addressing the congregation. And so there's a number of other accounts. Like one of them that I think is great is this one was discovered by the author of Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, John G. Turner, is that William Clayton, at the October 1844 conference, made a reference to Brigham Young looking and sounding like Joseph Smith to Wilford Woodruff in a letter on October 7th, 1844. He wrote, quote, God is with us. He is with the 12 in all their movements. And if you was here, you would see the mantle of the prophet on Brother Brigham very plain. And so Woodruff, even though he didn't write an account of it in his diary for the August 8th meeting, he did write a very early account of it, referencing that Brigham looked and like the mantle of Joseph had fallen on Brigham. In a letter to the saints in February of 1845, he wrote, quote, "On the second day of our arrival, August 8th, 1844, we met in a special conference, all the quorums, authorities, and members of the church that could assemble in Nauvoo. They were addressed by Elder Brigham Young, the president of the Quorum of the 12. It was evident to the saints that the mantle of Joseph had fallen upon him. The road they pointed out could be seen so plainly that none need err therein. The spirit of wisdom and counsel attended all his teachings. He struck upon a chord with which all hearts beat in unison." And so the last argument that I would respond to from Van Wagner and those who argue against the Transfiguration is that some said they didn't witness the miracle. And he cited, say, George Miller, who felt that Brigham's sermon, and this is George Miller in retrospect in his reminiscences in the 1850s, writing kind of negatively about the about Brigham's succession speech. And so Van Wagner says some people didn't experience it. Well, that's kind of the case with some miracles. And that's evident in Orson Hyde's own account of the Transfiguration of Brigham Young on October 6th, 1869. And so I'll end on this statement regarding the Transfiguration. He said, quote, "I sat myself down in the midst of the congregation with my two wives, whom Joseph had given and sealed to me. When President Young began to speak, one of them said, 'It is the voice of Joseph. It is Joseph Smith.' The explanation of the other was, 'I do not see him. Where is he?' Well, the thought occurred to my mind respecting the scripture which President Young had just quoted, 'My sheep know my voice and follow me.' Where is the one that recognized the voice of Joseph and President Young? Where is she? She is in the line of her duty. But where's the other? Gone where I wish she were not. The sheep of the good shepherd will follow the voice they know, but they will not follow the voice of a stranger." And so, yeah, that's kind of just a brief overview of my arguments in defense of the Transfiguration of Brigham Young. I don't know if there's any questions or anything that anyone would like to, any comments to add to that before we move on to the next, which I would consider a miracle substantiating or bearing testimony to Brigham Young's prophethood. So,
Well, I'll ask this question because, like, I usually like having these podcast episodes as like launching off pads for like further study. So, you kind of mentioned like say Jorgensen, others like what if someone were to go up to you like Jacob? This is great. What is there like a repository, like say primary sources or other works you would suggest on the Transfiguration of Brigham Young and that debate? What would you recommend?
so I think Scripture Central has Lynne Jorgensen's chapter that has her the expanded paper that goes into she compiled 100 and over 120 sources, and so that paper isn't just her interpretation of the sources. She offers her interpretation, but also goes into 120 plus sources compiled of the Transfiguration. So that is a great primary place to get a bunch of Transfiguration of Brigham Young. And I could probably send that link as well, link to my paper, link to uh, that paper, because I think both of those are, I think, great resources to substantiate the Transfiguration. So,
Yeah, send the link and I'll include it. So,
okay, perfect.
so if you want to move on to like the next topic, I'll let you do that. And if there's any questions that come up, I'll ask. I'll save them for the end.
Okay, perfect. So the next, we'll not go into as much depth on this one because this one's less talked about, is so in 1844, the church voted for the 12 to act in the place of the first presidency. They were so in the absence of a first presidency being organized, they were just acting as a united body in the place of the first presidency under Brigham Young as the president of the 12, acting as an unofficial president of the church at that time. But it wasn't until December of 1847, 3 years later, that the saints and the church leaders decided to have a new first presidency reorganized by Brigham Young. And so in church history, that period of time where the church is being led by the Quorum of the 12 in the absence of a first presidency it's called on the spine of volume 7 of the history of the church, the apostolic interregnum. So kind of a period of time without a presidency. And so in winter quarters in 1847, there began to be discussions about the church organization and about how to handle the different issues that they were dealing with. And there were some issues with certain leaders being kind of more independent than they should be, and kind of a disagreement or a discussion of sorts about whether Brigham Young as the president held more authority and weight to decision making than the vote of the Quorum of the 12 put together. And this came up because or excuse me, not Orson, John Taylor and Parley P. Pratt kind of took some independent course in while the 12 had gone to Utah and selected the new gathering place for the saints. Wilford not Wilford Woodruff, excuse me. There are a number of apostles that went to England in the post martyrdom time period. Woodruff went, Orson Hyde went, but the two apostles that were there while the rest of the quorum went to Utah were John Taylor and Parley P. Pratt. And when they got back from England to winter quarters, they had married plural wives without Brigham's authorization after, even though in 1846 they had agreed that no plural marriages should occur without the president of the church's consent and without occurring in the stake of Zion. And so they were present for that meeting, but they kind of took a very liberal interpretation of, well, Brigham and the apostles aren't here, but I guess we can have wives sealed to us in their absence. So that was part of the issue. And then the other part of the issue that was the bigger issue that really upset and frustrated Brigham Young was that they took what had been organized in winter quarters, where Brigham was wanting the immigration from winter quarters to Utah to occur a certain way with a certain amount of preparation and making sure that poor were not left behind, making sure that a certain amount of supplies were taken for each person coming to Utah. And John Taylor and Parley P. Pratt, in kind of zeal to get people to Utah, kind of disregarded the organization that Brigham had directed to be done to prepare for a second company coming to Utah in 1847. And they kind of overrode, I believe it was John Smith, the patriarch of the church. They overrode his leadership in that organization and kind of took over and went contrary to what Brigham had planned. And as they're crossing the plains to Utah, they meet with Brigham Young, and Brigham is pretty upset about them not following the organizational direction that he had given. And Brigham had actually even given direction to Parley and John Taylor to stay in winter quarters until we get back there. But they were anxious to go to Utah and be able to get kind of to get settled in to the new gathering. And so they didn't want to listen to that counsel. And so they went to Utah. There were some words exchanged between Brigham and Parley when they met, crossing paths with Brigham and the rest of the 12 going back to winter quarters, and Parley and John Taylor leading the second company to Utah, where Parley kind of said that I'm not, I'll be subject to the United Quorum. I'm not going to be subject to you criticizing me by yourself. And so Brigham and the other 10 or so apostles, nine-ish, I think, got back to winter quarters, and there began to be discussions about whether Brigham was right to rebuke Parley or not, like publicly, for changing the organization. And Orson Pratt is kind of arguing that I think that the united voice of all the 12 is better to go with than to have the president alone make a decision. Brigham retorts saying, I've never tried to make a decision without the 12 being united in behind me. And he says, if somebody makes an error publicly, I have the right to publicly rebuke him for that. And so these discussions kind of led to discussion about, now that they've got a new gathering place in Utah, how are they going to, govern the church with they're having members that are not yet in Utah, members that are back in the East, members in England, etc. like with church matters, with the Quorum of the 12 presiding, are they going to need to have at least 6 apostles present in Utah at all times to be able to have a majority of a quorum to make decisions? Or could they, Orson Pratt said, could we appoint 2 or 3 to kind of act as if they were the rest of the quorum to stay in Utah and have the rest be sent out to go lead the missionary work, etc.? And in those discussions, that is clearly sparking the idea of, should there be a first presidency reorganized? So there are a number of discussions about that. I disagree with how D. Michael Quinn tries to frame it as being like very heated debates where Brigham Young is like trying to bash Orson Pratt into submission over it. I don't see that in those. I didn't see that when I studied those minutes. I saw, friendly, genuine discussion about these issues on organization. And so that's kind of the thing I'm most proud of when I did my paper Succession to Brigham Young, is that I just kind of include large chunks of those discussions and debates from the raw minutes, which you can get the raw minutes in the book, that's digitally available, Minutes of Meetings of the Quorum of the 12. I know Robert has a copy of it and has enjoyed perusing it. I know that there's, I think it's an invaluable resource to understand leadership discussions in those minutes of the earlier days of the church that are available. And so they have these discussions, and finally on December 5th, 1847, they come together, and Brigham's like, I'm feeling from the Lord that it's time for us to discuss whether we should have a first presidency or not. And so they have this discussion, and it's, there's a lot of free views expressed where, like, Orson Pratt said that, he kind of felt that the 12 as a united body should continue to govern the church instead of having a new first presidency organized. You have George A. Smith and Wilford Woodruff, who kind of weren't, they say, we like how things have gone, but if the president feels that the Spirit of the Lord is directing this to happen, then I think that we're willing to go along with what the president feels the Spirit of the Lord directs. And it wasn't just Brigham feeling it, but there were other people who recalled that they felt the Spirit of the Lord give a revelation for them to reorganize the first presidency in that meeting. And they had this discussion, and finally, they, at the end of this, I think it was a 2-hour meeting, they voted for Brigham Young to step forward to be the new president of the church, and for him to nominate his counselors. They nominated Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richard to act as his counselors. But then what happened in connection to that, that's a very fascinating and underlooked at aspect of church history, is that there's accounts that say that there was a manifestation to the people in nearby houses where they felt like there had been an earthquake at the time that this revelation was given, this meeting of the leaders to reorganize the first presidency. And so there's a number of accounts of this. I like Orson Hyde's accounts, and I'll just read this one to kind of give context for it. So Orson Hyde, in a sermon on October 7th, 1867, said, quote, in the winter of 1847 or 48, according to my best recollection, the members of the Quorum of the 12 had a little meeting in what was called Hyde Park, Potawatomi County, Iowa. The subject under consideration was how the church should be organized. All at once, however, there was a power rested upon us that I had never felt before. And I must say, the voice of the Lord from heaven spoke to us and designated in a few words the way in which the church should be organized and established. Perhaps some of you may think that I am enthusiastic when I say that the Lord spoke from heaven on that occasion, but I will venture to say that there are those now within the sound of my voice who were not in the house where we were, but in the adjoining houses some 500 or 300 yards distant, who can rise up in this congregation and testify that the earth shook and trembled, and that men, women, and children ran outdoors supposing it was an earthquake or something of that sort. What was the result? That President Brigham Young be the mouthpiece of God and the leader and guide to this people henceforth. Or in a sermon in the Journal of Discourses, he recalled, he phrased it in the words that the Lord said to them, let my servant Brigham step forth and wield the full presiding power of this church and kingdom. And so what's fascinating is there's people who will say that Orson Hyde was just a tall tale bit. He just liked to tell tall tales, and that he wasn't a very reliable witness to things, because of first they would use the saying that the trans is giving his testimony of the Transfiguration of Brigham Young when he wasn't present for the August 8th meeting. But as I said, we can reconcile that with he could have been talking about experiencing it at the October 1844 conference, so the August 1844 conference. But the thing that to me is the most compelling witness to support this is that Brigham Young first references this experience about the earthquake. We don't have a lot of sources on it. I'll admit that we don't have a lot of sources to support this experience like we do the Transfiguration of Brigham Young. We have over 100 different sources of the Transfiguration, but in this we only have a couple sources. And one of them is that Brigham Young, in a quorum meeting with the 12 apostles on April 4th, 1860, mentions that people felt an earthquake when there was that revelation given. And so he's throwing this out as an argument when he's actually, the August 4th meeting is a fascinating meeting where Orson Pratt and Brigham Young are contending over Adam God concepts. And in there, Brigham Young throws out that Orson, you got the revelation with the rest of us in Potawatomi, and there was a power that came upon that shook the neighborhood. Basically they felt like an earthquake had occurred. And so that's mentioned in a private Quorum of the 12 meeting to Orson Pratt. And so if Brigham is lying about that, Orson Pratt was present for that meeting and the aftermath of it. He would have been able to say that that was a lie. And so the fact that Brigham's mentioning that first in a private quorum meeting, recalling it first, is strong evidence that they genuinely believed it happened. And then after that, Orson Hyde began to made two different public sermon accounts that we have mentioning this experience. And so even if, you might think that that claim of, the earth shaking as a manifestation of the power of God is an enthusiastic claim that's not well supported, the minutes themselves for the December 5th, 1847 meeting show that they mentioned that they had the Spirit of the Lord there in that meeting, and that they felt that the Spirit was giving revelation for them to reorganize the First Presidency. So even if you want to ignore this miracle, they still felt that they had the Spirit with them in reorganizing the First Presidency. For example, Brigham said, "The tappings of the Spirit to me is that the church ought to now be organized. The feeling that I have, and that the Spirit that guides, leads, and protects me is if this is not right, write it. The Spirit that prompts me to obey those steps, if the church to continue to stand as it is now, if the 12 stand as the presidency, or if the Lord requires them manifest, there'll be wisdom to have the First Presidency reorganize and liberate the 12. He says, my feelings are those that have originated from a spirit to me and which are manifest to me before. His mouth to me is manifest to me clearly, and that is the end of all controversy, and that is the end of the law to me. I act by that spirit. It is right. There should be a First Presidency." And then other members of the Quorum of the 12 felt that they had the Spirit give a revelation to organize a First Presidency. And so that's fascinating, is as an antagonistic to bring, as somebody who was the one who was opposing the motion, Orson Pratt was the one who gave the announcement that they had received a revelation to reorganize a First Presidency. So this is found in Hosea Stout's diary on December 24th, 1847, where they did a special conference of the saints in winter quarters to talk about this. He recorded, "Orson Pratt spoke at length on the policy of electing a first president. That God had saw proper to govern the church by the 12 since the death of Joseph the prophet, that he could govern it by whatever authority he saw proper, even by teachers and deacons. There was a time when this church was governed by the lesser priesthood, but now the Lord had manifest by his Spirit that it was best to appoint a first presidency again, that the organization of the church might be perfected, and the 12 have a chance to spread abroad again to the nations," etc. So Orson Pratt there saying that the Lord had manifest by his Spirit that it was right to appoint a first presidency. And so I've tried to collect sources on this experience. We have Brigham Young in that uh, April 4th, 1860 meeting. We have at the conference, I believe the other quote that I'm thinking of regarding the earthquake being felt by the people around them. Um, Let me see. At the October 1860 conference, both Brigham Young and Orson Hyde mention it, and then we have this other account by Orson Hyde 7 years later at the October 1867 conference. And so there aren't really a whole lot of other of sources to this. And so when we find a new one, it's great to have it. And one new account of this that we have is the minutes of the apostles in of the April 4th, 1860 meeting. We have the never before published shorthand minutes that were transcribed by Lejeune Carruth in 2011, I believe, if I'm remembering right, and didn't get publicized on the church history catalog until the last till very recently. I don't know the specific time they were published, but it's they came to light very recently and are publicly available now. And so just to read kind of Brigham's comments there real quick on the manifestation. So real quick, I'm just pulling up these minutes. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this or comments you'd like to make on it, Robert. Sorry, I feel like I'm kind of monologuing.
No, it's perfect. So go ahead.
Okay, so let's see. So these minutes, you can get them on the church history catalog. Orson Pratt, 4th April 1860, before Brigham Young and the 12. Papers of George D. Watt. It's in collection 4534, box 3, disc 2, in the church history catalog. Sermon not in the journal discourses or in CR 100-317. Transcribed, 2013, excuse me. Transcribed from George D. Watt shorthand, recorded by Lejeune Purcell Carruth, December 30th, 2013. And so there's new stuff on Adam God in these minutes that are very fascinating. I've done some presentations on those. But what the subject that we're talking about is the earthquake. Let's see. Shaking. Let's see. Personal. It's right after Brigham kind of talks about the Adam God doctrine. He mentions that as well. So okay. So kind of on page 27, he mentions this. He says, I tell you where I had a revelation as much as any man ever lived on the earth. It was when we were in Luke Johnson's room, when the power came upon us so that it raised the neighborhood. They felt it all over the neighborhood like the earthquake. And he's kind of correlating it with Adam God concepts. He says, there I told the story that you and I, faithful, we be Adam, and before it, we get a resurrected body and we're capable of commencing the work in spirit. It takes a natural body to beget a natural body, kind of Adam God concepts there. You recollect that revelation tonight to be true? Woodruff, George A., and you recollect it? Raised the whole neighborhood, the shake of the power of God that came on the neighborhood. So, I wish we had like George D. Watt's fleshed out version of these raw notes. Like when you read the Pittman shorthand, you realize that there's words missing. It's not. It's really good. It's about as close to verbatim as they could get back then, but it's definitely not entirely verbatim capturing every word. And so it would have been great if George Watt would have been able to capture, to kind of flesh out these minutes in more detail. But what it appears to be is that Brigham Young is saying Woodruff and George A. Smith and Orson Pratt recollect it, or he's either asking them or mentioning that, he seems to be mentioning that they recollect it, they recollected it, and it was raise the whole neighborhood, the shake of the power of God that came on the neighborhood. And so there's different ways to interpret the Adam God reference in connection to this. Before he's talking about this, he talks about in response to Orson Pratt criticizing him for Adam God, he's saying that he strongly believed that it went back to Joseph Smith. On page 26, just kind of going back a little bit, he said, "Who is preaching the doctrine of Adam being our father? To my personal positive knowledge, that was Joseph's doctrine and what he believed. You perhaps never heard him say it, but I have, and so did Brother Kimball and Willard Richards. That was his belief and what he knew. And he said that every one of us that kept the celestial law would be Adam's too. That was Joseph's doctrine. And as for Adam being made like an adobe, it was the height of nonsense." And then he talked about the revelation. And so I think why Brigham Young is correlating the revelation in winter quarters to saying that there he talked about Adam God concepts is because Brigham, in some of his discourses in winter quarters, does mention certain things that tend to lean Adam God. As February 16th discourses have a couple in 1847 have a couple Adam God statements in those that at least can be interpreted that way. They can be interpreted different ways, but um, very interesting thing with him talking about he believed that Joseph taught Adam God, and he's saying that he believed that Brother Kimball, Heber C. Kimball, and Willard Richards were there and also heard Joseph say it. When I saw those minutes, my initial reaction was, is he talking, could he be possibly referencing the May 4th, 1842 meeting where Joseph revealed the endowment, because it was Brigham, Willard Richards, and Heber C. Kimball, who were the three apostles that were present there when Joseph revealed the endowment ceremony. And there, according to Willard Richards' account of it for the history of the church, Joseph was talking about the order pertaining to the Ancient of Days. So he's talking about Adam at some degree in revealing the endowment ceremony. So it seems very possible that that was the occasion that Brigham is recalling that Joseph taught something that he interprets as being Adam God teachings. And so I know, Robert, you and I were planning on having a discussion about Adam God at some point. This is obviously not, the subject of this lesson.
Surprise debate, heretic. By the way, just on the issue of Adam God, I think it would be useful to have maybe like an episode where it's not a debate per se, but we actually kind of go through like some misconceptions about it.
Okay. Yeah, we were talking about this for a couple of years ago, and it was, I'm trying to remember who was going to moderate it.
But then I had to move to this country, so.
Yeah, he was wanting to moderate a discussion on it, and so it'd be definitely to do it.
I think we could also rope in Chris Blight because he does know his stuff about that as well. Again, not to debate Adam God, but like for people who like myself don't believe in Adam God, like what it actually entails, and like really bad apologetics, like Brigham was misquoted or the Pitman refutes it, which it doesn't. But but we can hash that out like maybe later this year. But yeah, I'll let you keep going.
Yeah, Blythe would be great because he is a mainstream member, and he kind of, you're a mainstream member who doesn't accept Adam God, and Blythe is a mainstream member who, at least from his Ward Radio discussion on it, was saying that maybe we shouldn't, he was more friendly to it, right? Is kind of how he came across in that Ward Radio discussion. I don't think I'm misrepresenting him he was more focused on correcting the history because there was an episode before that trying to deny that Adam God ever happened. And he's like, actually, Adam God did happen. And so he was good for that reason. So Blythe really knows his sources. And when I was actually working on my paper on Adam God contradictions, I actually, there was a couple things that I was wrestling with, like different aspects. And I kind of asked him, I said, what do you think about this aspect of Adam God and how, different positions on it? And he and I, we bounced ideas around on that subject. So yeah, he'd be great for that subject. But yeah, totally a different conversation, but fascinating minutes. Definitely worth checking out for anyone who are researchers that are interested in that subject. And also, it goes into a number of subjects. There's, it's a rich, I think, over 30 pages, probably, I think, over 40 pages um, of of uh, of material in that document that's very new. And so, yeah, highly recommend it for researchers interested in that subject. And so, but yeah, but I was appealing to that as a reference to people feeling this miracle at the time the 12 got a revelation to reorganize a first presidency. And so I talk about that also in my Succession to Brigham Young paper. And so to just kind of cover one last little area, I don't know if you have any other thoughts or comments before we move on to the last little
Um,
subject.
yeah, I do have like two questions from the audience, so might as well just like hit these out. Someone asks, is there any scholarship on the succession crisis compared with the calling of new apostles in the New Testament?
Hmm. That's a good question. You probably uh you're more well read than me, so
Yeah,
I don't
I'm
know if
gonna
you.
scratch my head like on the exact like relationship. But I don't know any of it off the top of my head in terms of like say how they succeed in one another. So, but I'm sure like if you look at like say LDS commentaries on the Ephesians 2 and 4 and Acts 1, I'm sure there'll like be some discussion. So, Kirk Watson, who's written some books, as a question, in 1844, was there any precedent or teaching in the church that would justify something like the Transfiguration as a trustworthy sign of authority?
That's I think I've heard that kind of rebuttal before, and that's uh I mean, there's scriptural accounts of you know um where Jesus was transfigured on the mount, kind of revealing his divinity to those chosen closest apostles. You have Moses after he's on the mount with God is transfigured. His face is shining right. Um, I don't know of any historical precedent to like doctrinally defend transfiguration. You can make a fascinating argument of that there's spiritualism, which was a movement in the 1800s, that there were other accounts of people having transfiguration experiences, but they were considered very dubious, very not well attested, very sketchy. And so this is very different than those accounts in that where they were not well attested, whereas in Brigham Young's case, it is very well attested. The way Wilford Woodruff talked about the transfiguration of Brigham Young on one occasion, he kind of says that it was a very unique experience because of the unique circumstances the church was in, where they were having to figure out, the saints were, where to go leadership wise, because they had Rigdon rising up and claiming leadership when he was in the first presidency and he'd been close with Joseph from the beginning of the church versus others. And so I would say I don't see any specific precedent for it, but they kind of viewed it as based on unique circumstances. They had a unique experience. And so Wilford Woodruff, in Journal of Discourses, Volume 15, page 81, said, I have heard two or three of the brethren testify about Brother Brigham Young in Nauvoo. Every man and every woman in that assembly, who perhaps might number thousands, can bear the same testimony. I was there, the 12 were there, and a good many others, and all can bear the same testimony. The question might be asked, why was the appearance of Joseph Smith given to Brigham Young? Because here was Sidney Rigdon and other men rising up and claiming to be the leaders of the church. And men stood, as it were, on a pivot, not knowing which way to turn. But just as Brigham Young rose in that assembly, his face was that of Joseph's. The mantle of Joseph had fallen upon him. The power of God that was upon Joseph Smith was upon him. He had the voice of Joseph, and it was the voice of the shepherd. There was not a person in that assembly, Rigdon himself not accepted, but was satisfied in his own mind that Brigham was the proper leader of the people, for he would not have his name presented by his own consent after that sermon was delivered. There was a reason for this in the mind of God. It convinced the people. They saw and heard for themselves, and it was the power of God. And so, based on this and other of Woodruff's accounts, I do think that Woodruff experienced it in the afternoon meeting on August 8th, 1844, which Lynne Jorgensen admits that there are some accounts that tie it to the August 8th afternoon meeting, but they're rarer than the morning meeting accounts. And so, it was kind of a unique circumstance based on a unique situation that they were in. So the question of succession to the 12 comes up a bit, where people ask, well, by what justification, for the 12 to step forward and lead the church? And in many of those discussions about it, we will, appeal to Section 107, where the united voice of the 12 could act as was equal to the first presidency. And that was one of the arguments that W.W. Phelps used, and that some of the others used, was appealing to the fact that the 12 had been given charge to lead the missionary work, and so they would make a good case as one of the quorums that stood next to the first presidency to be the temporary leaders for the church. But the 12 also appealed. So there's a concept of appointed succession that you find in the Doctrine and Covenants, where it said that Joseph would have power to appoint his successor. And Brigham actually commented on that at the October 1844 conference. He said, did Joseph appoint someone to be a successor? He did. It was Hiram, and Hiram unfortunately died before Joseph did. So Joseph had said before the martyrdom that if he were to die, he wanted his brother Hiram or his brother Samuel to stand in his shoes to lead the church in the event of his death. But Hiram died before Joseph, and Samuel died a month later, and so that's what led to there even being a major succession crisis, which in my opinion necessitated the Transfiguration miracle. But one of the things the 12 did use to try to argue for being appointed in a way to lead the church is the event known in church history known as the Last Charge. And the Last Charge is actually kind of a conglomeration of two or more different things, at least two different things. You could argue it's not, a lot of accounts frame it as occurring in one meeting, when there's actually a decent argument to make that it was, some of the accounts admit that it was months of instruction that Joseph had given to the apostles shortly before his death. But essentially, that they would appeal to these last charge events, where Joseph is where they view in retrospect that Joseph was preparing for the leadership of the church to fall on other people in case he were to die. And so Mark Tensmeyer actually made a good analogy, because some of these accounts kind of tie it all together as occurring in one big meeting in March of 1844. There Joseph gave temple ordinances and then gave a massive speech about the responsibility of bearing the kingdom is, I'm rolling it off of my shoulders onto your shoulders. But the reality is the meetings where temple keys were committed most likely we're talking about other meetings that related to the anointed quorum, whereas the speech where Joseph reviewed his life and suffering and told them to bear off the kingdom to the world, that was in the Council of 50. And so Mark Tensmeyer had a great analogy for this that would be a good apologetics for the Last Charge, is that, in the early revolutionary period, with like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you have events that are framed as a one-day event in history that are actually, that are a series of meetings and that occurred over a period of time. And so he saw that as an analogous to the Last Charge. But essentially, there's a number of statements about Joseph before his death getting special revelation that he needs to give the temple ordinances and the keys to perform temple ordinances to men close to him before he died, so that if he died, that they would be able to perpetuate, have that authority and be able to preserve the ordinances that Joseph was intending to reveal in the temple. So that's the first part, is that Joseph takes them through the ordinances and gives them the keys to perpetuate the ordinances. And the second part is the speech that was known as the last charge speech. So Wilford Woodruff gave a good account of the keys aspect of it in a sermon on December 12th, 1869. There's actually a ton on the last charge. D. Michael Quinn and Andy Ehat have done a bit of work going back and forth on this issue, and there's over 100 different accounts of the last charge. Both there's just dozens and dozens of accounts. I have my own compilation that I've been working on of accounts of the last charge. So Wilford Woodruff referenced that first aspect of the last charge about temple ordinances and temple keys being given. He said, Joseph Smith was what he professed to be, a prophet of God, a seer and a revelator. He laid the foundation of this church and kingdom and lived long enough to deliver the keys of the kingdom to the elders of Israel unto the 12 apostles. He spent the last winter of his life, some 3 or 4 months, with the quorum of the 12, teaching them. It was not merely a few hours ministering to them the ordinances of the gospel, but he spent day after day, week after week, and month after month, teaching them and a few others the things of the kingdom of God. Said he during that period, I now rejoice. I have lived until I've seen the burden which rests on my shoulders rolled onto the shoulders of other men. Now the keys of the kingdom are planted on the earth to be taken away no more forever. Until he had done this, they remained with him, and had he been taken away, they would have had to be restored by messengers out of heaven. But he lived until every key, power, and principle of the holy priesthood was sealed on the 12 and on President Young as their president. And so there's another one that's really good by Orson Hyde on the last charge, where Orson Hyde said that Joseph, he says brother Joseph, in one of these councils, there's something going to happen. I don't know what it is, but the Lord bids me to hasten and give you your endowment before the temple is finished. He conducted us through every ordinance of the holy priesthood, and when he had gone through all the ordinances, he rejoiced very much and says, now you, if they kill me, you have got all the keys and all the ordinances, and you can confer them upon others, and the hosts of Satan will not be able to tear down the kingdom as fast as you will be able to build that up. And that was during the trial of Sidney Rigdon on September 8th, 1844, that Orson Hyde made that statement. So there's a lot of references to keys being given, and then there's a lot of references to the speech that Joseph gave, telling them that he's rolling the responsibility and the burden onto the shoulders of other men. And one of the accounts that I like is by Benjamin F. Johnson. There's a lot of other accounts out there. I just think he's a good he wasn't an apostle, but he was a witness to it. And he said that this charge wasn't to the 12 alone, but to all of the priesthood brethren in the council that were there. And he said that this was in the council of 50 that this speech was given. And it was to the 12 in connection with the Council of 50. So he said in a letter in 1903, and now returning to the Council of 50 and the last charge, he had turned the keys of endowments, the last anointing and sealing, together with the keys of salvation for the dead, with the eternity of the marriage covenant and the power of endless lives. All these keys he held, and under these then existing conditions, he stood before that association of his select friends, including the 12, and with great feeling and animation, he graphically reviewed his life of persecution, labor, and sacrifice for the church and kingdom of God, both of which he declared were now organized upon the earth, the burden of which had become too great for him longer to carry, that he was weary and tired with the weight he had so long had borne. And he then said, with great vehemence, and in the name of the Lord, I now shake from the shoulders the responsibilities of bearing off the kingdom of God to all the world. And here and now I place the responsibility, with all the keys, powers, and privileges pertaining thereto, upon the shoulders of you, the 12 apostles, in connection with this council. If you'll accept to do that, God shall bless you mightily and shall open your way. If you do it, I shall now shake my garments clear and free from the blood of this generation and of all men. And shaking his skirt with great vehemence, he raised himself from the floor, while the spirit that accompanied his words thrilled every heart with the feeling that boded bereavement and sorrow. So recently, there's been an uptick of arguments against the last charge of Joseph Smith giving the 12 authority to lead the church actually happening. And this actually goes back to the Council of 50 Minutes being released in 2016, because a lot of historians were expecting there to be the last charge included in the Council of 50 Minutes because of Benjamin F. Johnson and other sources that tied it to the Council of 50 where it occurred. So the Joseph Smith papers editors, in their great footnotes and great commentary, argued that on March 26, 1844, that they believe that's when Joseph gave this extended speech, the last charge speech. It was basically an extension, in their view, of the charge, the initiation charge that was being given to new members of the kingdom of God to carry on Joseph's teachings and the organization as Joseph had revealed it, basically to take his responsibility that was on his shoulders and place it on others, is what the Joseph Smith paper said. And so they understood that speech as occurring on that day, but they said the only brief note in the minutes that they viewed as probably where the speech occurred was saying that Joseph continued his speech on heavenly matters and many other important subjects. Very brief comment, unfortunately, not a very detailed account there, but they said that's what likely marked the last charge speech in the Council of 50 Minutes. And so there's actually not, so that's not really a great, additional witness to the last charge, unfortunately. But a year later, the Council of 50 Minutes on March 25th, 1845, have a discussion about the last charge because Orson Hyde is wanting to publish a certificate he had written, a very detailed certificate about Joseph appointing the 12, the authority to lead the church. And he brings this certificate to the Council of 50, wanting as many as were present to sign it as witnesses. And there's a bunch of discussion about that certificate where there's suggestions with different wording. Orson Pratt said he remembered Joseph Smith made similar comments to what Orson Hyde is recalling, but he said, I wouldn't want to go out that that's when the 12 had our authority because we had our authority prior to that time. And he said, I'd be willing for the certificate to go out with that correction. But then finally, Brigham Young shut down the discussion, saying he wanted Orson Hyde to write a farewell to Rigdonism and to leave the 12 alone, that that he didn't care whether the world knew the power and the authority of the 12 or not. When the time came, they would feel our power, is what Brigham said. He said, in regard to Joseph's remarks, he made no mention of the anointing. He said it was this Council of 50 which was to bear the responsibility of bearing the kingdom in all the world. And so the fact that Brigham didn't want the certificate published and corrected Orson Hyde's account, that there wasn't a mention of the anointing during the speech, and that Joseph had told the Council of 50 to bear off the kingdom to all the world, that those things have caused certain people to argue against the last charge being a legitimate event for success, to justify succession to the 12. And this started with a paper by John Dinger. I'm trying to remember. I think it was published in the John Whitmer Historical Association's journal, if I'm remembering right. But it's called, I believe, Orson Hyde. Let's see. Something about Orson. It's like Orson Hyde, the last charge, a reevaluation, basically. And he tries to argue against the last charge being significant to succession. And he makes decent arguments. I feel like he makes.
By the way, I Googled it. It's the Council of 50, Orson Hyde, and the Last Charge.
Thank you. What year was it published, if you remember, have it off the
JSTOR has it as 2017.
Okay, 2017. So a year after the Council of 50 Minutes were released. And I haven't actually seen anyone really rebuttal John Dinger's paper. If there is any rebuttals out there, I would love to see them. The only one that I'm aware of is my own personal rebuttal to it, because I was fascinated with the Council of 50 Minutes and the last charge as it related to succession. And so this is probably the first paper that I published on church history, where, self-published, but I presented it at Sunstone in July of 2018, entitled New Light on the Council of 50 and Joseph Smith's Last Charge. And I published it as an issue of my magazine, One Eternal Round, issue number 4, New Light on Joseph Smith's Last Charge. I also put that one up for free as you can download it, the PDF on my website, One Eternal Round, and I'll give you a link so you can link it in your description as well. And so my response is that, so John Dinger made some decent arguments. He tries to say that Brigham Young doesn't use the last charge in his August 8th succession speech. He says that William Clayton doesn't mention the last charge in the July 1844 initial succession discussions, and that Brigham doesn't want Orson Hyde's speech published, certificate published in 1845 about the last charge. And so he basically argues, and what I actually realized later is that after that event in the Council of 50 in early 1845, the apostles had been using the last charge to argue their claims in late 1844 and early 1845. But after that, they kind of stopped for a period of several decades. They stopped generally using it as a strong argument for their succession claim. I believe in response to Brigham Young saying that to Orson Hyde, saying, we don't need to prove our authority. And so the reason I think that the justification, I think that John Dinger is partially correct in that the last charge was not originally intended as a succession related thing, because Joseph was intending succession to Hiram or Samuel, in my perspective, from William Clayton's diary saying that and other sources saying that. But it was appointing those who were closest to him, basically telling them to keep alive the teachings and everything that he had restored. And so even though I believe that it wasn't at the time succession related, in that it wasn't viewed at that time, in retrospect they look back on it and said he was telling us to keep alive everything that he had restored, and telling us that we would be damned if we didn't live up to keeping alive what Joseph had restored. And so it was reinterpreted as appointing succession, even though it wasn't necessarily doing that, in my opinion on it. And then I also covered the subject of, was there an anointing or keys given? That's, I think, pretty indisputable. You have the anointed quorum meetings where Joseph gave the apostles all their ordinances, and you have other people who recognize that Joseph had given them the sealing power and temple ordinances. You have hostile witnesses to that. And so that's kind of my response to John Dinger, is saying, yes, it wasn't technically understood as a succession related thing when Joseph was giving it. It was just telling them to keep alive what Joseph had restored, both teachings and organizational wise, and that they felt that played a role in additional justification for the apostles stepping forward to keep alive Joseph's teachings after his death. So that's kind of just a very brief, sorry, we've been going on for almost 2 hours, but a very brief summary of my perspective on the last charge. And like I said, I consider it significant because it's I see it as Joseph empowering those brethren in the kingdom of God to keep alive his teachings. And kind of the original plan in 1844 was actually to send out these men to build up churches throughout the Americas, throughout at least the United States at that point. But even some missions were sent up to Canada, and that was the context of it. And so there was, I believe, some degree of authority implicit to it, even if it wasn't succession related at that time, if that makes sense. So.
Oh no, this has been great stuff, and I know for 2 hours for you that's nothing. You can stream like for 4 and 5, and those who've been on your channel know that's not a joke.
Yep, I mean it's rough to go 4 or 5 hours, but
yeah, I remember like a recent video you did where it was only like about 16 minutes, and as a joke in the comments is like, Jacob, are you okay?
Yep, and it's the new challenge is me trying to do shorts and trying to fit a lot of it, important information in a 2-minute thing is like the opposite of going 2 to 3 hours on a presentation. So yeah, that's I think all of these different things that's important as Latter-day Saints who believe that Brigham Young was the legitimate successor to Joseph Smith to understand, Transfiguration, the later reorganization of the first presidency, and the last charge related events. One thing that I will uh, add, because you had somebody ask if there's anyone that compared it, any scholarly studies that compared the succession after Joseph's death of the apostles taking the leadership of the church to the New Testament, right? That was one of the questions in the comments. Um, one thing that comes to mind that I didn't mention was in response to that is that in reading Journal Discourses, Volume 19 currently, there's after Brigham Young's death, the apostles are repeatedly um, using it as an analogy, like bringing to mind the death of Jesus and the apostles carrying on the church after Christ's ministry, to the apostles carrying on the church after Joseph's death and also after Brigham's death. And so, for anyone that's interested in some primary sources making analogies, like Orson Pratt actually gave a great sermon that specifically touches on that analogy um, on October 5th, 1877, Journal of Discourses, Volume 19, pages 111 to 119 for the person who had that kind of question. And I'd just like to say, my last little suggestion is all of these things are important aspects of church history. They can be daunting historical matters if you're, like most people aren't equipped to go be digging through, um, they don't have the time, right, to do the historical digging that some of us have been fortunate enough to be able to do. But one great thing that I would recommend for people who, if they haven't seen it before, a great way to commemorate the August 8th succession to Brigham Young and the Transfiguration of Brigham Young would be to go watch the Interpreter Foundation's movie 6 Days in August if you haven't seen it, because it actually touches on um, you know it touches on the succession crisis. It touches on the last charge is touched on there. They depict Joseph giving the 12 the keys and mention the last charge in there, and they go into the Transfiguration, and a number of other, temple related things as well. And so, a great resource, dramatization of a lot of these church history subject that us church history nerds are uh, very privy on. And was when I saw it multiple times in theater. I thought it was pretty well done. I don't know if you've seen it, Robert. But
I have not, but I've been told it's very good. So
yeah,
it's on
yeah.
it's on my to watch list. But the heretic that I am, I didn't even watch Witnesses yet. So
I'll be honest. I've only seen clips from Witnesses. I was, I should watch Witnesses. I've heard that, good things about Witnesses, and I heard that 6 Days in August actually was even better than Witnesses in the acting department, from what I've heard from people who've watched both movies. And so it's kind of a follow up to Witnesses for those who've watched Witnesses about the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And so highly recommend it. Love the work that the Interpreter Foundation has done to, in apologetics. And also I'd say, after 6 Days in August, one thing I haven't watched is that Daniel Peterson announced after 6 Days in August, because there were certain things I was like, they touched on a number of things in Brigham's career that prepared him to eventually be the successor of Joseph Smith. I thought it was great, touching on Brigham's earlier periods in the church and experiences. But there are other things that they didn't touch on. And I was like, oh, what about this or what about that? And Daniel Peterson left a comment saying that we actually plan to do a deeper dive into Brigham Young in our is it called Defending Brigham series? What they've called it.
Yeah, in fact,
Um,
it was plugged a couple of times during the fair conference during breaks.
okay, awesome. Yeah, I actually haven't been able I haven't watched the Defending Brigham series yet. I was kind of, procrastinating it, but I intend to watch those as kind of a follow-up to 6 Days in August, because Daniel Peterson has kind of recognized the need to defend Brigham as the second prophet of the restoration in the wake of all of these attacks that are online about him nowadays. So really appreciate his work, and think that this movie did a phenomenal job. So yeah, watch it with your family if you know, think your family will enjoy a church history movie about the succession going to Brigham in the 12th. So
Cool. Well, let's see if there's any questions from the audience. Doesn't seem to be. I think we've covered that. So, before we end, any final comments or anything else you want to say?
nope, I think we covered quite a bit. Thanks for having me on and letting me
My pleasure.
share my perspectives on these things. So
No, my pleasure. As I said, later drop me a message with the links you want me to include in the show notes, and I'll pop them in as well. So
perfect. I will do
cool.
that.
No, perfect. So, Jacob, thanks again for coming on. Really do appreciate it, and thanks for everyone who tuned in or will watch this episode later. As I said, the next episode will be hopefully Friday at 11 Utah time, 6 p.m. my time. It will be with Jennifer Roach, and we'll be discussing justification, the doctrine of justification in LDS and evangelical Protestant theologies, and other related topics as well. So it'll be a fun one. But yeah, thanks again, Jacob, for coming on, and really do appreciate the work you've done on this and other topics as well. So thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having me, Robert, and good to have another discussion with you. So
thank you. Take care.
okay.